Hi, folks. Welcome. I see that there are loads of names showing up in the participant lists here, and I am here as, I guess, an MC of sorts. I'm not sure. My name is Brian Horton, and I am joining you today with from the traditional territory of the Ton Quitchun Council and the Kwanlundun First Nation. Settlers know this as Whitehorse Yukon, and I am a member of the climate change research team here at the Yukon University Research Center. So I'm really grateful for the opportunity to present or to sort of open this conversation, and looking forward to hearing from Isabel and Ryan and Dylan about the work that they've been doing. Due North is sort of the first recent estimate, or I think that really the first time to tackle what is climate change going to cost, and what is adaptation going to cost on the pan-northern level. There have been attempts at doing this at sub-scale, sub-regional scales previously, but this is the first crack at it at a really pan-northern level. By way of introduction of myself, I've been able to participate in the development of this report as a member of the Adaptation expert panel behind the scenes. So I didn't hold the pen, but I was able to guide which way it went from really early on. I recall conversations, probably 2 or 3 years ago of, the scoping and the initial development of this report. And it's so exciting to see it finally coming forward and open to the public. So I'll also just sort of note that on a personal level, this report is really important to me in my work, but also I live in the north. I live in a place where permafrost is just down the road from me. So it's really meaningful to see this coming forward and becoming a bigger part of and a more structured part of the national discourse about climate change impacts and adaptation. So it's not an abstract thing for me to see, infrastructure being impacted by permafrost thaw, and to see how, our ways of lives are being impacted. I live in a city. Whitehorse functions as a city. It's got lots of services that you wouldn't expect of a northern community, perhaps, but I am absolutely aware that, I'm very fortunate. I'm in a privileged position here in my place in the Yukon, and I know that there are lots and lots of people elsewhere in in Yukon and elsewhere in the Northern Territories that are really on the front lines of permafrost thaw impacting their ability to access land, their day-to-day lives, the housing that they live in, the buildings that they work in. It's pervasive, and so I am so thankful that the Canadian Climate Institute has been able to tackle this one, and I think I'm supposed to pass to Ryan to really queue up the next speaker. So thanks very much for allowing me to open the conversation, and I'll be sort of checking back in as the moderator during the Q&A period. You will be invited to enter your questions in the Q&A box if you wish. And also we have the magic power to unmute you. I don't think we can turn your camera on, but we can magically unmute you during the Q&A period as well. So over to you, Ryan. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Brian, and thanks everybody for joining us today for this overview of our report that was just launched, Due North, Facing the Cost of Climate Change for Northern Infrastructure. In addition to Brian, joining us today are Dylan Clark and Isabel Bugeaud. They are researchers at the Canadian Climate Institute, who really did the lion's share of much of the work. Dylan especially was the primary researcher and the primary author of the report. So he and Isabel will be walking through our findings and recommendations about the implications of climate change for infrastructure in the north and what governments need to do about it. But I will first give you a little context for how this report fits into a broader program of adaptation research at the Canadian Climate Institute. Due North is part of a longer series that we've been working on for at least 2 years, as Brian indicated. The intent of the series as a whole is to broaden the discussion about how serious the impacts of climate change will be for Canada by taking an economic lens and intentionally focusing on economic impacts to connect to different audiences that aren't already talking about adaptation, decision makers in the highest levels of government, economic and financial sector leaders in Canada, those who really need to understand and internalize how much of a threat climate change is, and the language they understand is the language of economics. We're also highlighting how critical it is to not only recognize the scale of those impacts, but how important it is for governments to take action to reduce those costs, to drive climate change, or through driving climate change adaptation in all aspects of life and in all places across the country. So we've done reports that have had a completely national perspective. Those first 3 reports were really looking at impacts across the entire country. But when working on underwater, our report on infrastructure damage and potential economic consequences across Canada from climate change, we realized through the inputs of Brian and others that impacts to infrastructure in the North needed to be discussed separately for a number of reasons, because the North has a unique history and relationship to decision making in the South, and having often not been involved or served by that decision making. Because infrastructure is uniquely important to Northern lives and livelihoods because of the remoteness and the often harshness of the environment in which it needs to serve people in the North, and the lack of redundancy when infrastructure doesn't work, as well as the overall scale and speed and type of climate change impacts in the North, which are unlike anywhere else in the country, including but not limited to the fact that permafrost is inexorably thawing. Next slide, please, Dylan. So we, in focusing on Northern infrastructure impacts, we've pursued the objective of improving a sort of broad understanding about the potential costs of climate change impacts to infrastructure in the North, economically for certain, but also in a sort of broader sense for what it means for the people who live in the North that are experiencing and will continue to experience the consequences of inadequate infrastructure, already inadequate infrastructure that's being further impacted by climate change, and highlighting how important it is for governments, starting with the federal government, to support a concurrent undertaking of adapting infrastructure in the North, but also addressing the existing gap between the level of service that Northerners get from their infrastructure and those that people in the rest of the country do. So we hope to equip Northerners and Northern governments to and other stakeholders and rights holders with the information they need to make that case. As Brian noted as well, we've been thinking about this for quite some time. And with the valuable advice from Brian and other members of the Institute's independent advisory adaptation expert panel, who had Northern perspectives, who live in the North, who work in the North, who've worked with Northerners on climate change research, that it was really important that we take the time on this project to do it right, and to make sure we understand the differences in the North, the perspectives of Northerners regarding what their experiences are, because there, among many other things, there's a long tradition of Southern researchers and policymakers assuming they understand the North and know what is best for the North in doing this kind of work. So acting on this advice, we engaged from the very first stages of the scoping of the project with Northern governments, stakeholders, and rights holders. We also formalized a working group of our adaptation expert panel, including Brian, to advise us throughout the course of the research and the writing of the report. And we continued over the course of the research and the writing to engage with Indigenous communities, with local governments, territorial governments, federal departments with northern mandates and northern industry stakeholders to show them what we were uncovering and ask their advice on how we could frame it appropriately into a story that is true to the northern experience and that will help Northerners make the case for better. Next slide, please. So the approach we took in order to sort of balance those mutual objectives of telling a sort of technical story, but also a story of what climate change infrastructure damage means for the North, is we first did our regular technical thing where we use climate modeling and infrastructure impact models to estimate the amount of damage and the cost of damage a shifting climate might result in for northern infrastructure, especially around the effects of thawing permafrost, which was really the focus of our report, the effects of thawing permafrost on roads, airports, and homes and buildings. And as Brian mentioned, a first pan-northern analysis of those impacts, because very little is actually currently understood about the effects of climate change on permafrost thaw at a pan-northern scale. So we had to develop new projections of climate change impacts to be able to do this work. We also looked at the effects of warming on season length for winter roads and their long-term viability, recognizing that was another key element of the road picture in the North as well. But next slide, thanks, Dylan. But because of what I mentioned earlier, the relationship between Northerners and infrastructure, the importance of trying not to impose a remote Southern perspective on the interpretation of our technical analysis. With the advice of our expert panel advisory group, we added scope to our research to hear from and give voice to Northern and especially Northern Indigenous perspectives. And in to do so, we worked with the Firelight Group, who's an Indigenous owned and operated research and consulting firm that has experience supporting communities across the North, to interview people that are First Nations and Inuit across Inuit and Nangat, the Northwest Territories and Northern Ontario, about their experiences of climate change on infrastructure. So you may be wondering, how did we define the North in our work? And you can see here on the map that the geographic definition we used based on the Arctic and Northern Policy Framework. So that includes the Yukon, the Northwest Territories, Nunavut, Nunavik, and Nunatsiavut, as well as northern regions of BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Ontario. And it's important to understand an important piece of context that comes up continually in our report and is really an important overall framing, is that Northerners are experiencing what we call a Northern infrastructure gap. Northerners don't have the same quality of infrastructure and the services that infrastructure provides as many other people, most other people in Canada, and that makes this challenge of addressing climate change doubly difficult. The other important piece of context that we also highlight repeatedly is that climate is warming in much more quickly in Northern Canada, especially in the Arctic, than it is in the rest of the country. As you can see from this chart, these are the two emission scenarios that we considered in our modeling. In a low emission scenario, the numbers alone are quite shocking. 4 degrees of temperature warming in the high Arctic if the world gets its global greenhouse gas emissions under control, 8 degrees or up to 8 degrees if we end up in a high emission situation where we don't, and the global community is not successful in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So it's not just a future issue. We highlight that climate change is already impacting infrastructure in the North. Permafrost thaw is already happening and impacting buildings and roads and airports and other infrastructure today, and that other types as well, although we don't focus on them in our analysis, we highlight that other types of extreme weather and climate change are impacting communities in the North, like flooding and coastal erosion as well. So with that, I will turn you over to Isabel, who's going to walk you through some of the interesting technical findings from our analysis in terms of the impacts and the cost to that important northern infrastructure that we assessed.
Thank you, Ryan. So as Ryan highlighted, to analyze current and future impacts of climate change, we sort of wove together both model economic costs and Northern Indigenous perspectives and knowledge. For the first modeling piece, we projected climate change impacts at over 150 airports across the North. Our analysis considered how permafrost thaw could alter runway repair and replacement costs with and without adaptation practices. So based on our permafrost impact modeling, we find that the costs associated with runway damage will increase rapidly over the coming decades. Our analysis shows that future runway damage is going to be concentrated in Nunavut and the Northwest Territories, mainly because of the number of airports located on permafrost in those regions. As you can see in this graph here, there are regions where direct runway impacts under a high emission scenario may cost a similar amount or less because the permafrost thaws faster and it becomes more cost effective to completely rebuild runways. However, the key word here is direct. The costs do not reflect the indirect costs and service disruptions, which would likely be much higher in a high emission scenario. As described in other studies, as well as the work of Firelight, we recognize that airports serve vital roles, and when airports are not dependable, there are huge indirect costs. For example, people with medical emergencies may not be able to access medical care. We also note in the report that these costs and disruptions are already happening in many places across the North. The second area of our analysis was an examination of climate change impacts on northern roads. To assess the impacts of permafrost thaw on roads, we analyzed about 60,000 kilometers of permanent roads across the North. We examined impacts of permafrost thaw on road surfaces and looked at cost savings from adapting roads using base layer reinforcement and air-cooled embankments. We also assessed the impacts of temperature changes on about 6,000 kilometers of winter roads. And most of these winter roads across northern Canada are located in Ontario, Manitoba, and the Northwest Territories. This slide here shows our projection of winter road viability, which we model based on temperature projections. You can see here that we project that about half of winter road kilometers will be unviable within the next 30 years. And winter roads are critical for many communities in the North. And when they cannot be built, supplies will often need to be flown in, or a permanent road may need to be constructed in the case where this is possible. And this could have huge impacts on the cost of food and the cost of building materials. As mentioned, we also analyze impacts of permafrost thaw on roads with and without certain types of adaptation measures. This graph here shows the projected cost for permanent roads across Yukon, again, with and without adaptation. As with other graphs in the report, the left side shows costs under a low emission scenario, while the right side shows costs under a high emission scenario. As indicated in the legend on the far right here, we are looking at both the no adaptation scenario overlaid with projected costs with adaptation. You can see that the adaptation measures we model can save northern governments millions of dollars per year. However, the ratio of adaptation cost savings for northern roads are much smaller in comparison to road adaptation cost savings in southern Canada, where we found that relatively small investments can save billions of dollars. This is mostly because adapting northern roads by reconstructing them with base layer reinforcements or air-cooled embankments is very costly. As with our winter roads analysis findings, this suggests that the current road system in the North may not be financially sustainable with or without incremental adaptation. And this really highlights the need for more transformative adaptation approaches. Our final area of analysis focused on the impacts of permafrost thaw on homes and buildings. We estimated permafrost impact costs for about 90,000 buildings across the North. And our analysis looked at impacts of permafrost thaw on repair and replacement costs of buildings, and calculated cost savings from adaptation by reconstructing buildings' foundation using thermosiphons. Based on our permafrost impact modeling, we find that the costs associated with damage to homes and buildings are going to be concentrated in, again, the Northwest Territories and Nunavut, because those territories have the greatest number of buildings on permafrost. We see from our modeling that there is a wide range of uncertainty, but generally we expect costs to increase dramatically in the mid and late century as permafrost thawing speeds up in those higher latitudes. As Firelights work articulates, there are also huge indirect costs from these impacts. These impacts have the potential to worsen housing shortages if homes become uninhabitable and are not quickly replaced. Further, many of those costs will fall on government, given that private home ownership is much less common in the Northwest Territories and Nunavut as compared to Southern Canada. Because the experience of Northern rights holders and stakeholders with infrastructure and climate change are different than those in the rest of Canada, engagement has been particularly important in this report. Northerners we engaged noted that the North is not uniform, and the functions that infrastructure serve differ significantly from region to region. Governmental roles and responsibilities regarding infrastructure and climate change adaptation also vary widely among regions. But regional differences aside, 4 key themes did emerge through the analysis. First, people think about infrastructure through a lens of the services it delivers. Infrastructure services and impacts to livelihood are interconnected, and impacts have huge knock-on effects. Second, we heard that Northern governments need more support and the right kind of support. Current resources are not sufficient to address the current gaps, let alone address climate change impacts. Third, we also heard that solutions should be oriented around the services that communities need and driven by rights holders and Northern governments, instead of being driven by Southerners. And finally, communities in the North noted that they are most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change on infrastructure because colonial, paternalistic, and damaging infrastructure policies have not adequately considered the infrastructure needs of Northerners, leading to inappropriate and neglected infrastructure. Successful adaptation of Northern infrastructure requires fixing these policies, not just more patching up of the infrastructure that is already there. I'll now pass to Dylan, who will go through the recommendations and conclusions.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Isabel. So coming away from this analysis, we really had 5 overarching insights. First, that Northern infrastructure is already failing to meet people's most basic needs. Even without adaptation or climate change impacts, there's a lack of adequate infrastructure, and it's limiting access to essential services, whether that be healthcare or safe drinking water, especially for Indigenous Northerners. Second, Northern Indigenous people face elevated threats. Colonization has deeply affected the adaptive capacity of Indigenous peoples across the North, and that harm continues today. Third, critical services are at risk here. Northern infrastructure and critical services are increasingly exposed to climate change, threatening people's lives and livelihoods. Fourth, there is a lack of coordination in terms of the response. Current approaches to building infrastructure resilience are not working. Adaptation interventions to improve Northern resilience have not been sufficient to date. And then finally, incremental adaptation approaches, which Isabel touched on, are not sufficient on their own. Transformative adaptations are really crucial to reducing vulnerabilities. And investing in adaptation is a clear opportunity to transform infrastructure that is no longer working or, frankly, has never worked for Northerners or Indigenous peoples. So, as we've done with other reports from the Canadian Climate Institute, Due North concludes with 4 major recommendations for government and policymakers. First, being that funding for northern infrastructure and services needs to increase and also be restructured. More and better funding is needed, and this includes flexibility so that northern governments can access funding easier. Second, better information is needed for evidence-based decision making. It's important that northern Indigenous governments have input into and, in some cases, control over how data is managed, modeled, collected, and stored. And this can ensure that the information is usable and reflects northern realities. Third, replacement of infrastructure should be prioritized over repairs. And this is because existing infrastructure may no longer be viable even with more incremental adaptation approaches. So governments should seek out opportunities for transformative adaptation by developing next generation northern infrastructure systems that kind of leapfrog historic infrastructure models. And then fourth, infrastructure policies, regulations, standards, and codes should be updated to explicitly account for the impacts of climate change. We think that in the coming years, a great deal of new infrastructure is going to be needed to be built to ensure that people have access to basic services, whether that's clean drinking water or housing. Regulatory changes can ensure that this new infrastructure is built to withstand current climate change risks as well as the climate change risks on our horizon. So finally, because colonization and racism are key root causes of climate change infrastructure vulnerability across the North, we sit all 4 of these recommendations and really root them in a guiding principle of self-determination. Throughout this work, as Isabel and Ryan have talked about, we tried to create space for the knowledge, perspectives, and insights of Northerners and Northern Indigenous peoples. However, this report and our recommendations don't provide a comprehensive picture of what climate change means for every single person or community across the North, nor is it a one-stop roadmap for government action. Implementation of the recommendations will require meaningful engagement with Northerners, with Northern Indigenous governments, and adherence to the truth and reconciliation principles. I want to take a minute to thank and acknowledge the involvement of the many individuals and organizations that have contributed much of their time and insights over the past 2 years of this work. Some of those individuals are listed here. And with that, I want to pass it back to Brian, who's going to moderate question and answer period. Really encourage you all to raise your virtual hands for asking questions, or feel free to post questions in the chat. We are able to answer questions in French if you would like to ask one in French, or post a French question in the chat too. Thank you very much. Over to you, Brian.
Thank you. So, dive in. Questions welcome. And maybe while you're formulating your questions, I'll throw one your way. So we're here in Yukon right now, we're experiencing a really high flow year for many rivers throughout the territory. So I'd love to hear your insights on how you might be able to expand this analysis to include other climate impacts. You've started something really cool by looking at permafrost thaw, but yeah, what's next? How could we build from here?
Dylan, I can start, I guess, as the water engineer guy, and you can fill in some of the blanks as well. Yeah, it's a great point, Brian, and as we mentioned in the report, probably don't do enough justice to, is that it's not just permafrost thaw that is going to impact the North and impact the North uniquely and acutely. Flooding is definitely one of those issues, both inland and coastal. The work that we did actually on national infrastructure impacts looked at, as you may recall, the effects of climate change on flood risk across the country. And while the data available for the North outside of built up areas like Whitehorse was not all that great at that point, we do have some insights into what climate change may mean for flooding in major population centers like Whitehorse and Yellowknife. But yeah, there is the need, and we highlight throughout this series that we're just scraping the surface. We are hopefully capturing and analyzing some of the biggest and most important and most costly ways that climate change will affect Canada, but we haven't captured all of them, and we can't capture all of them as a small organization with limited resources. Governments need to invest in developing the information that communities, municipalities, and business need to be able to understand their risks under a future climate, whether it be updated flood mapping that reflects climate change or coastal erosion maps, just to name two examples that would be very important for the North. Even our permafrost thaw projections, while I think useful as a first cut when there was no other data, really need the heft of a major government organization with major academic support to be able to develop the detail that is needed about permafrost thaw in the North to be able to successfully respond to it. So yeah, great point, Brian. We hope by highlighting how much even the tip of the surface is scary, that we can get governments and others to invest in uncovering sort of what's below the waterline.
Super, thank you. And so, Alexi, you've jumped in with a question. Do you want me to read it out for you? Hi, Alexi. I'm gonna flip off camera here. This is how we get. We've got my climate change secretariat shirt. Thanks to the Nunavut climate change, or the Nunavut climate change secretariat. So I should have worn it today. I'm sorry, but Alexi is asking about how we'll use or how Climate Institute can use this report to feed into the National Adaptation Strategy effort that Environment and Climate Change Canada is currently leading and gathering input for.
Maybe I could start with this one too, Dylan, just because I've been asked to represent the Canadian Climate Institute on the infrastructure expert group advising the National Adaptation Strategy. So I will certainly be doing my best to bring these messages forward. They have also asked Infrastructure Canada, who is chairing that group, also asked Dylan and I to present the findings of our analysis to that group early on in their discussions. So hopefully we've sort of injected this issue as a priority into their discussions, and from what I've seen since then, it continues to sort of be relatively top of mind. And like all our reports, we hope that the federal government will take them and use the insights that we generate, hopefully new and useful insights, to inform what they select as priorities for especially the federal action plan, which will be the federal government's commitment to its part of implementing the national adaptation strategy, which is going to come out with the strategy in October. Dylan, anything I left out there?
One thing that stands out to me with the national adaptation strategy to date, that the draft that's been shared anyways, has been that there isn't a lot of region-specific consideration or even risk-specific consideration in there. So it's an interesting question, and hopefully we get hopefully as feedback comes, maybe that or in the implementation planning that becomes more clear. So
sorry, Brian, just to mention as well, I forgot that we also have Sarah Brown from the Northwest Territories Association of Municipalities. I may be getting her exact organization name wrong, but a strong sort of northern voice around northern infrastructure on that national adaptation strategy expert group as well.
And Sarah's one to speak up, so that's great. I'll move to our next question here. So I'll read it straight off. Leonardo has asked, and I'll sort of preface by saying, we talked about exactly this at one of the expert panel meetings. So thank you for bringing it forward now. Do you have any perspective of how the impacts you considered for the infrastructure could influence the national security sphere for Canada, considering a shifting geopolitical scenario in the Northern Hemisphere, specifically over the Arctic Sea?
Brian, I can start off here. So yeah, wonderful question. As Brian said, we have spent a lot of time thinking about this, particularly in the last 3 months, as you mentioned, as the conversations have changed with Russia's war in Ukraine. I think 3 things to point out and to point you to. First, in the report, we highlight that defense policy historically has been a mechanism for infrastructure development, and in many cases, infrastructure development and colonial policies that have been really harmful to communities and to Northerners. And so that context is really important and something we embed in early on in this report. In terms of what climate change impacts and our findings mean for, traditional defense infrastructure today, we point out that there are impacts to runways happening right now, and certainly that we project will increasingly happen. Those can have and do have bearing in terms of operations for the Royal Canadian Air Force. There's impacts to sea level rise that will affect the small number of ports that are existing across the north, and impacts to roads have bearing in terms of ability of, again, traditional defense ability to respond and move around the region. The third and potentially kind of, in terms of how to address this, we do say that there's importance of thinking about northern needs and taking direction from northern rights holders in terms of future investments. So when we think about the so what needs to be done policies and investments, it's important to remember the past and not repeat those mistakes, and make sure that infrastructure is serving communities better. And we also point out that there's probably kind of ways that we can kill 2 birds with 1 stone in some regards, and that investments communities want, whether that's deep water ports or more reliable airports, may have side effects and benefits to, again, more traditional defense response. So a number of points there. It's something that we don't really directly jump into at the report. Again, as we've been working on this for 2 years, and this is much more of a recent conversation with current events, but there is relevant pieces certainly throughout the work.
Thank you. So we've got two questions in the Q&A box. So I'll move to Mali's question next. And I might riff on it just a little bit. But how do you think different levels of government, municipal, provincial, federal, and I'll add Indigenous, can work together to enhance the community's climate resilience? And I'll challenge you double extra to give some specific examples, either from Canada or if you've run across really good examples in the sort of international sort of pan-Arctic nations world, I guess.
So I'll start out here, and Ryan, you can kind of bring your more regional government hat to this question too afterwards. But I think one of the bright spots we have heard about through our engagement is a funding program that Canada set up just a few years ago through the Crown Indigenous Northern Relations and Health Canada partnerships. And they kind of rethought the model of funding in terms of how federal dollars are being spent towards more local and regional adaptation approaches, and created kind of working groups of individuals. I believe even like Brian, you're involved in the Yukon kind of working group in terms of deciding where money and resources go and what the priorities are. And so while that's not yet been a model that's used for hard capital investments and infrastructure being built, it is a model that I think has a lot of important benefits and kind of lessons learned in terms of ways that the federal government can hold up and elevate the voices and needs of Northerners, and giving greater agency to people living in the region and knowing what priorities are. I don't know if Brian or Ryan want to add to that.
I could just touch quickly on some of our recommendations too, Dylan, around how, in addition to, and this connects to some degree as well with Joseph's question in the Q&A, the federal government, especially in addition to providing it more funds, needs to make sure that those funds are provided and made available in ways that are accessible to Northern communities, especially those that have less sort of public servant capacity, less person power to be able to chew through grant applications, to be able to complete infrastructure projects within sort of a year or very limited time frame for certain types of funding. We heard from many people across the North that the way funding is distributed from the federal, but also from territorial and provincial governments, is not useful and not structured in such a way that Northern communities can take advantage of it, either best advantage of it or advantage of it at all. Also, we heard that, like Joseph is pointing out, that Northern governments, territorial, Indigenous, municipal, need more capacity to be able to plan for and analyze their infrastructure adaptation needs, and to think about what the sort of future generation of appropriate infrastructure looks like. And there's also a lack of capacity in terms of skilled people to be able to actually design and build the infrastructure that the North needs. So, another limitation that if it's not addressed, no amount of money is going to sort of help solve the problem. Brian, I'm sure you have some thoughts on this. We've chatted at length about some of these issues over the course of our research. Interested to hear your thoughts too.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I'm thankful that Dylan raised the climate change preparedness in the North and the climate change health adaptation program. So that's a joint operation between Health Canada and CERNAC. It has been really empowering for the local sort of the regional committees to be able to really help distribute those funds. I guess a challenge that those regional committees are still facing is, ensuring that adaptation and resilience is being built by the project. So it still relies on the communities identifying the needs and articulating them in a a structured enough way that that they can receive the funding. And so there certainly are challenges still to really find and proactively identify the areas where adaptation benefits can be the greatest with funding. I guess I mean other examples of programs. I mean there are other funding bodies for sure, and I think big barriers that that municipalities and provincial and indigenous governments are facing, especially, is some of the boundaries that are put on funding calls. So reporting requirements can be a real barrier, and the matching requirements. It's quite common for a funder to seek out a cash match or an in-kind match, and that can be a big barrier for a lot of organizations where funding uncertainty is an underlying theme. The planning horizons for municipalities in particular in the Yukon, I can't speak for all of the Northern Territories, but certainly municipalities in Yukon, I mean, they have acute capacity constraints for sure, but then their planning horizons tend to be, quite long. So that is another challenge that they face in terms of being able to interact with one another. So yeah, really, if there are funders on this webinar, I would really encourage you to engage in conversations that allow you to really flex your funding. That's a hallmark of the CCPN and CCHAP funding, is that there's a lot of flexibility built in, and really consider the implications of some of the funding boundaries that you're putting on, because those constraints can really have an impact on a go no go decision from a lot of the organizations involved. So I'll move to Joseph's question here in the Q&A area. So, do recommendations for increased funding extend to creating more capacity at the policy making level within territorial governments and First Nation governments? So I'll open first to Ryan and Dylan, and if opportunity presents, I might chime in too. Thank you.
So one of the kind of pieces that or comments that arose frequently in our discussions with, frankly, both industry, territorial governments, indigenous governments across the north was this capacity constraint. And one of the things we heard, and Ryan touched on this, is that if there's technical capacity that's built, be that policy capacity or even kind of trades capacity for capital projects, because historically funding for infrastructure particularly has been kind of boom and bust and fairly significant ebbs and flows over period of time, it makes it really challenging for governments and industry to keep those skilled professionals up north and employed in community, whether that be a policy kind of wonk that's working for a government or trade skills, and that means that it's, as Brian kind of mentioned, really tough to meet funding needs and surge back up capacity when there is an opportunity. So going back to the recommendations, one of our kind of the details of that funding recommendation in terms of how to restructure it is that stable funding is really important so that governments can build that capacity and maintain that capacity over longer durations of time. I don't know, Ryan, if you wanted to add anything to that.
I think it was a great summary, Dylan. I'll just slide over and let Brian add anything that he has.
Yeah, Again, I'll use a very region specific topic to answer the question, but from my perspective, absolutely there is a need for increased capacity at the policy making level within territorial governments. And one of the reasons I say that is not that the existing capacity is poor in any way, but that the complexity of the questions coming forward in areas such as regional land use planning really require more people to help answer. Yeah, like I think, Yukon has the umbrella final agreement and then self-government agreements with 11 of 14 Yukon First Nations. Those provide an excellent framework for building resilience once implemented. But there are so many moving parts within implementation of those agreements that that there are acute capacity barriers to really meeting the expectations there. So yeah, I mean, from my perspective, absolutely, the recommendations speak to a need for capacity across many disciplines, and policy making, policy implementation would certainly be one of them. So I'll move to the next question in the chat box, and Leonardo, you're getting in two questions, but I'll make a final call for other questions, because I believe this was scheduled to go just for an hour, but I know I can stick around for another few minutes. But yeah, that's on I don't know who makes that call. Maybe Dean makes that call. So do you have any policy recommendation based on your research, maybe considering other jurisdictions overseas in terms of properly fostering the energy transition or developing pathways towards it while adapting infrastructure to climate change impacts?
I can start with a general answer, and I'll turn it to Dylan to talk about what that might mean specifically around the North. But all of our research on infrastructure has highlighted, or on the climate change impacts on infrastructure and the need to adapt, has highlighted that we're sort of at we have this unique but also critical opportunity to rethink our infrastructure in the face of both a changing climate and a global energy system and economy that are going to change completely. And there's a limited amount of time, there's a limited amount of ultimately resources to make that happen. So absolutely every initiative, every program that is oriented towards adapting infrastructure to climate change impacts also has to be considering how whatever that money is or effort is spent on also foster the energy transition, and vice versa. All of the investments that are being made in the infrastructure for an energy transition or to develop a low carbon economy or transportation systems or what have you, need to also consider what opportunities and needs they create for adapting to climate change. So at a high level, absolutely, I think we bought into that, and we're starting to see that recognized more and more in the halls of government. Dylan, maybe I'll turn to you to talk about what that might look like in the Northern context.
Yeah, and we don't dig into the specifics in terms of a circumpolar jurisdictional scan or anything, but we do highlight that other countries are doing better. It's not an inevitability of a high latitude that infrastructure is not meeting people's basic needs, and Canada is falling behind and can be learning from other jurisdictions, as you point out. And so I think it would be further kind of analysis and another project to look specifically at examples, some that come to mind without really having done a thorough piece of research, would just be kind of looking at geothermal that's going on in Greenland and Iceland. Small modular nuclear reactors have gotten a lot of traction recently, but certainly more work would be needed to further explore what is potentials there are, as well as what Northerners want.
So Dylan, you were brief enough that I'm going to sneak one last question in because I think it's an important one. Anonymous attendee, hopefully not the anonymous, has asked, what is the mechanism through which recommendations will be addressed and by whom exactly? And so I'll jump in and just say that the Canadian Climate Institute, I mean, they're a policy research group, and so not directly implicated in the implementation of recommendations. But man, they've only been around for a couple of years and they have the ear of governments. It's amazing to see how they've been able to really influence policy discussions at the government, at a few government levels. And also they're looped in with the financial and insurance worlds. And so those are some of the places, and I take it as homework for me to really amplify this work and share it in the conversations that I'm part of to really hopefully influence policy. And I'll turn, I'm not sure, Ryan, Dylan, paper rock scissors, because you've got 1 minute.
I'll take this one just quickly, Dylan, to also thank Brian and give Brian and other experts and other volunteers who contribute to our organization, who have allowed us to have the impact that Brian has talked about in a short time. But quickly, yes, we try to not only influence government decision makers directly by hoping that they will read our reports and take them into consideration when they are developing policy, but to also equip others to be able to do this, or to advocate for better climate policy as well, and for attention to key issues. So that is, for the folks that are on this call, that's another really important mechanism for how we hope that our research and our work has influence, is that you then are able to take it and use it to connect with those that that are in positions of authority and decision-making ability to do better and to sort of drive Canada's fight against climate change.
Right on. So Dean has dropped contact info into the chat box there for folks who are still hoping to ask questions. And I am very thankful to both the presenters and attendees for their questions. So yeah, have a great rest of your Friday. I see one last question is where can we read the full report? So Dean, maybe if you could drop the link into the chat box to everyone, and I'll close there. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. And thank you, Brian.